welcome everyone, and it is great to be here with you all. And so welcome. I mean, the Growth Center is a brand new deal. I just want to spend 2 minutes explaining what the Growth Center for Northern Seminary does. My name is Tommy Lee. I'm the Executive Director of the Growth Center for Church and Mission for Northern Seminary. My other hat is I am the President and Founder of Resource Global that works with young Christian marketplace leaders in different global cities, integrating faith and work, justice and mercy through a biblical grid. So I get a chance to travel to Nairobi and Jakarta and Singapore, Malaysia, different places like that. And also I get a chance to work with wonderful individuals like a Brandon O'Brien and wonderful organizations like City to City, which I am I'm looking forward to introducing that. But specifically here for today, I really want to be able to just give you a 2-second thing. We're going to have monthly events every single month, just really be able to introduce you to different people like a Brandon. So for instance, we're going to have a little gathering with Catherine Leary Alsdorf for some of our pastors and marketplace leaders in Nairobi. We're going to do something with Andy Crouch in November. David Kinnaman from the Barna Group will be jumping on in December. So every single month, our goal is that we're really going to be able to introduce you to a wide range of different people. And what we're trying to do, and Brandon, I'd love to get your input on that, is we want to create the ecosystem for the entrepreneurial ministry leader. What do I mean about that? And let me just read what I wrote. It brings together pastors, ministry leaders, and marketplace leaders who are finding creative ways to utilize their faith and their talents to bring the gospel to the cities and communities they live in. These are men and women who could be defined as the entrepreneurial ministry leader. They may be bivocational, co-vocational pastors who are entrepreneurs and business leaders, owners. They may be pastors looking for creative ways to use their church or staff to create income and revenue for sustainability. They may be ministry leaders who are looking for ways to launch for-profit initiatives or integrate innovation into their organization. They may be those who want to do missions globally or find creative ways to create that sustainability. Or they may be marketplace leaders, and some of you guys are sitting here who are called to stay in the marketplace but want to be part-time pastors, lay pastors, ministries, nonprofits. This is the age of the new ministry leaders. They wear different hats. They do different things. They are technologically savvy and global. And in some sense, there will always be a place for those who graduate from a 4-year seminary and then work in the church full time. But now you're seeing so many different pastors doing different things. You're seeing bivocational, you're seeing all these things. How do we continue to create this ecosystem and network where we learn from one another? Simply for me as well too, I spent 12 years building cell towers for AT&T, Verizon, Sprint. That's where I learned a lot of my project management experience. Then from that point, I spent 3 years as a pastor, realized God did not want me to be a pastor. That was not my calling. Then spent another 3 years in a seminary setting, actually in administration at Moody Bible Institute, and realized that I actually needed more freedom to create different things. Now as an entrepreneur, I get a chance to work with the Growth Center here with Northern Seminary. I get a chance to work with Resource Global. I started a business called City Leadership Center in Jakarta. I also am the managing director of Together LA, a movement of pastors, marketplace leaders, and leaders in the LA market. And so a lot of times I love to find like-minded individuals as we create this cohort and this ecosystem together. With that said, one of the things that we have to do in our role as ministry leaders is to create content. And that is the one thing that especially in this COVID season, there's so much need for people to receive content, read content, and opportunities to create content. And so as a result, I said, well, I need to do that here at the Growth Center. So let me bring my friend Brandon O'Brien, who I met at a conference that we did together in Chicago, for him to share some best practices, because not only are you a writer, not only are you an author, and then you wrote your newest book, and I'd love for you to share that book here, but you also are doing the same thing for City to City, which when people think about it, it's Tim Keller, but how do you make it less Tim Keller centric, even though he is the most important voice, but how do you create the network of city to city? And so let me actually just share with you a little bit about Brandon Bryan, Director, Content Development and Distribution for Redeemer City to City, where he coordinates, edits, and shepherds writing projects with Tim Keller and urban church planters around the world. You have served in pastoral ministry, worked in publishing, author a few wonderful books, which I'd love for you to explain later on, and taught for state and Christian colleges and universities, and you currently live in New York. And so with that said, I'm going to ask Brandon to speak and teach to us and share some thoughts for about 30 minutes. In the remaining 30 minutes, I'd love to hear your comments or your questions, and so put it in the chat section. And so I'd love to ask Brandon. So Brandon, I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you, Tommy, for a kind introduction. Thank you for everybody for tuning in. And I've got, so I'm trying to decide exactly where I want to start with this. I think I'm assuming that everybody here in the call is involved in ministry leadership at some level. I'm curious, you can use the thumbs up reaction here maybe as a yes. Zoom only allows you positive reactions. You can't do thumbs down or no's. So you use the thumbs up. Let's do this. If you're in local church ministry vocationally, can you give me a thumbs up? Who's here, like local church vocational ministry? Got it. Okay. Who's in something like Christian nonprofit ministry? Okay. What about more generally marketplace business, not necessarily nonprofit or local church ministry? Got it. Okay. So fairly even distribution of people. Very good. Well, one of the things I find, as Tommy mentioned, is that we are in a state of, or a time in history where everyone is a content creator. And at some level, I reject the terminology because I hate the word content for anything that a human creates. It is sort of a bloodless, empty sort of word. And it's been foisted on us a little bit by the internet, because the internet, it craves content, right? It just needs to be filled up with material for other people to consume. And so on the one hand, I find myself trying to facilitate the contribution that those of you in leadership of various sorts have to provide. On the other hand, I do want us to always be thinking about the quality of those things that we're producing, and not just, that we have to make it. And so I'd like to do a quick little poll, if I can share my screen, because everybody's expected to be a ministry leader or a content creator. I work with people who have various feelings about those responsibilities. And so if I can, let's see, we'll go to here. And work from home means, okay, here we go. I don't have my old computer set up and I'm still learning. Let's see if this will work. All right, can you guys see that big slide?
Yep, okay. Can.
Okay. All right, so here are the various response or kind of points of view I see on writing. One is, I love to write and I want to get better at it. It's my hobby, it's my passion, it's my calling that God sort of gave me to write things for the good of the church or for the world. That's probably the smaller percentage of people that I typically work with. The second number of people second kind of category of people I work with will say, I hate to write and I have to get better at it. But, the last thing I wrote was maybe in high school or college, and, sort of like math, I thought I'm not going to use this in the real world. And now I got to write a newsletter, and I got to write a blog post, and I've got to send out donor information, fundraising packets and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't sign up for this. And I don't like to do it, but I have to get better at it. And then another group of people just don't really care. These are the pragmatists that I don't really relate to, but I know a great deal of them, which is, it doesn't matter whether I like it or I don't like it. I just got to crank it out. So tell me how to get the job done. At some level, I respect this perspective on writing. But I'm curious, maybe how many of you would associate with that top category? I love to write and I want to get better at it. Give me a thumbs up. Good. A few of those. All right. How about the second category? I hate to write and I have to get better at it. Good. All right. And then third, I don't really care. It doesn't matter how I feel. I just have to start cranking stuff out. Interesting. That's an underrepresented group in our little cohort here, it looks like. Great. So in my role, let me tell you a little about me. In my role, I kind of operate in all these worlds in different ways. One, I'm a writer, hopefully improving. I listed a few titles here. The very first was a book called The Strategically Small Church. And the two, if anyone has heard of any book that I've written or co-authored, it would be one of these other two, Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes or Paul Behaving Badly, both co-authored with my friend Randy Richards. There have been a few more since then, roughly in the genre of biblical interpretation and cultural, the ways our cultural location influence how we interpret Scripture and our faith. That's sort of my theme that I've been working on. So I do my own writing. I'm hopefully getting better at it. I also coach others in writing, helping them improve. Before my job at Redeemer City to City, I spent time at Leadership Journal, which was part of Christianity Today, for several years. And then as a freelancer in the Christian book industry, did a lot of one-on-one coaching of first-time writers. Most of them were ministry leaders. Most of them were entering the writing process with a lot of ideas and experience communicating those ideas verbally, orally, but not a lot of writing experience. And so another kind of category of things that I've done in this arena is helping writers who are not terribly confident become more confident in the process and begin to produce writing. And then the third is I'm in my role at Redeemer City to City means that I'm directing global resource development and trying to find a coherent strategy for doing that. And so as a sort of brief introduction to Redeemer City to City and what I do there, we traditionally train church planters for planting in global cities. In the last few years, we have transitioned so that more of our training work is done by local leadership. And so for the first time, I think it was last year, for the first time, we didn't have any global training events in New York. For the first time last year, all of our global training events were run by local leaders all around the world, which was a major milestone for City to City. And so what we do now, instead of training church planters directly, is we train the people who train them. And we equip people who are working on trans-denominational, citywide, gospel-centered coalitions for church planting and city renewal and those kinds of things. My job is essentially to figure out what those folks in those roles need and help to create the resources, but more directly helping our local leaders create those resources for their local contexts. And so we're trying to find a unified content strategy that involves repurposing old material, training materials turned into distributable resources, or sermon series from Tim Keller or someone like that turned into distributable articles and things.
Something is.
And then distribution is another major challenge, just trying to get resources around the world. And as a good example, I think I have to stop sharing my screen to share this file. Let's figure out how to do that. As a good example of a kind of resource that really pulls all of these things together is so sorry, I've lost control of my computer. Here we go. We recently created this resource that called How to Reach the West Again, which is a booklet by, I've just put the link in the chat, a booklet created from presentations that Tim Keller gave, first in Chicago. So Tommy would have heard some of those, then sort of adapted and delivered, contextualized in a city-to-city conference in Poland. We kind of pulled those talks together and turned it into a distributable resource, which is it's ebook right now. And then we invited global partners around the world to give responses to that and express in what ways does Tim's presentation here make sense in your context? What would you add? What would you subtract, etc. So this had kind of involved revision, editorial work, writing, coaching, repurposing of material, kind of the whole thing, right? So in some ways it represents, and it was globally coordinated, kind of represents the work that we try to do. And as many of you know, you do 10 things and one of them really hits the bullseye and the other 9 are kind of scattered around. So this past year, one of the real bullseye wins for our content development at Redeemer City to City. So you take a look at that at your leisure. I think what I wanted to zero in on in our time together is I think there are very practical things that we can talk about, and I'm sure your questions will get us to those. But I think one of the things that we want to be clear on when we start with resource development or writing more generically is really kind of understanding the motivations and expectations for what we're doing. And so what I want to kind of walk through in the next few minutes is in my view, trying to take account for why we write and managing our expectations. So let me go back to here for just a minute. We talked a second ago, we got with a show of digital thumbs about various motivations or interests in writing. And I think there's kind of 3 things that I see come up again and again, why people start writing. So one is there's a financial upside, money. For some people, this is for themselves. They view an alternate opportunity for revenue and want to increase resources in that way. Other people view content resource development as a great revenue opportunity for your church or organization. And so a way to maybe fund the mission by creating and selling resources. Other folks think in terms of metrics like marketing, visibility, retweets, shares, impressions, clicks, all those kinds of things. That's kind of the measure of how the material is being received, but also gives you some tangible way of measuring the impact of your organization, your ministry. Sometimes you need these kinds of things for reporting, whether that's for grant purposes or whatever it may be. And then there's finally, some people think of it more in terms of just the ministry side of it. Sometimes ministry, especially if we're talking about organizations, can reduce down to money and metrics, right? So I'm kind of, it's worth keeping in mind that sometimes when we say we want to expand the ministry, what we really mean is we want to raise some money and so it's good to try to sort out what we really mean. But sometimes we're talking about kingdom impact. We've got good ideas. We just want to get those good ideas out into the world, right? Or we have seen that these resources help people in one context. We believe they can help people in another context. And so we want to push those resources out as far as we can. There's really none of these is a bad motive. None of them is outright wrong, but each of them does impose some temptations and limitations, right? So if your primary motive, for example, is generating revenue, then you may begin that process somewhat idealistic, but pretty soon you're going to have to make strategic decisions on what to do and what to not do. And if your primary motive is revenue, then revenue is going to drive your decisions about what to print and what not to print, right? So I mean, you can start out, it serves you, but then eventually, you may be serving it. Metrics and those things are similar sort of deal. Good things to track. It's helpful to know what resonates with people and what doesn't. But if you're only looking for clicks, you're only looking at impressions, et cetera, then that's going to affect the tone of your writing and the kinds of things you offer, et cetera. So it's not bad or wrong, which is something to keep in mind. Here's some sort of expectation management. As of 2018, the median income, book-related income for published authors in the US was $6,000, meaning half the people who write books in America make less than $6,000 a year doing it, and half the people who write books make more than $6,000 a year, and that half includes, you know, Stephen King and those people. So it really skews the numbers when you think of who's in which category. I put this out here just to say, if you're primarily motivated to create content for the purpose of generating revenue, there's not a lot of encouraging data out there about how helpful resources are for generating revenue. Sometimes if you think about content simply as a you know, social media post or something like that, it's a little bit different. But if you're thinking of longer form things, there's not a ton of money in it. New books per year in the US, if you include self-published titles, is roughly 1 million new titles a year, which is just to say that if exposure and metrics are one of your primary motivators, you've got a whole lot of noise to compete with in the market to get your message out there, right? And I feel this very keenly and have expressed to publishers before and friends in marketing that it really feels when you publish a new book or have a new resource available like you're kind of screaming into the jet engine, and you know, you may get a few people's attention for a very short amount of time, but like 2 days later all the excitement of launch day is over and it's just you and 1 million other people trying to sell your resources, which can be discouraging. As of, I think, the end of last year, there are something like 500 million blogs worldwide, and less than 10% of them generate revenue. So 10% of 500,000 is still a lot, but our odds are limited. If you take kind of all these things together, it seems that being primarily motivated by revenue, primarily motivated by sort of massive measurable influence, etc., are not wrong, not bad, but can lead to frustration and disappointment, right? So I think one of the clearest ways of sort of measuring success and figuring out how to maximize your time as a content creator, if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time and you're doing this as your second or third or fourth or fifth job or whatever that is really becoming very clear about who you write for. Who are your materials for? Who is it that you're trying to serve, help, etc.? And another way to say this, obviously, is that you're focusing on your audience. And I think being really clear about who your audience is can help you measure success. Because if you're measuring success by saying, I want to be, you know, a certain sales rank in Amazon, or I want to hit a certain revenue target, or I want, you know, top search on Amazon or on Google or something like that, those are very elusive things to aim for. But if you can measure or define your audience fairly narrowly, and there are ways then of measuring whether you're successfully serving that audience, right? So at Redeemer City to City, my audience and client, meaning these are people that I coach and serve, as well as people that I'm creating resources for, are urban church planters. We could get even more specific than that if we start talking about content. But what this does for me is it means that I'm not trying to produce resources with mass market appeal. I'm not trying to produce resources for general ministry consumption. I'm specifically thinking about the unique challenges of church planters, and in particular, people who are planting in major urban centers, major urban areas, and the unique challenges that come along with that, right? So that kind of massively reduces the potential audience, the potential primary audience. It doesn't mean that other people can't read those things or take that course or download that podcast or whatever. But that, to me, that additional broader market are my tertiary and further out audiences. I'm happy for them to like it. But the way I've articulated it internally, just to keep all of us on the same page, is if a resource is a success in the mass market, but is not useful to the church planters we serve, then that's a failed resource. But if it is helpful to the church planters that we serve and does not have mass market appeal, it is a successful resource. And that becomes just a very concrete way of determining whether we are accomplishing what we set out to accomplish in resource production. I have to, because our work is global and because my content development team is a 2-person team, I have to define success fairly narrowly, because otherwise, if I sit for any amount of time and contemplate the enormity of the task in front of us, I very quickly become discouraged about the fact that, like, oh gosh, we don't have any resources in Farsi, and we don't have anything in, we don't have these 2 things in Spanish. We don't, so I have to just narrowly define that this year we have these 4 major projects for this audience. We're working to get these things into translation. It seems very modest, but one thing I've heard Tim Keller say before that I really appreciate is we tend to overestimate the amount of work we can do in a year and underestimate the amount of work we can do in 10 years. And so what I'm trying to figure out how to do is make small strategic plans that in this fiscal year may seem small, but 10 years from now, in retrospect, shows a strong cumulative impact. And being able to measure success in those terms is encouraged by having a very narrow audience. Also, being really clear on your audience improves your writing. So when you know who your audience is, that influences everything from your tone, how you write about what you're writing about, to the content. What am I narrowing in on specifically? And the more specific your audience can be, the better. So I think we like the idea that our resource is for Christians, or, you know, American Christians. Well, which American Christians? Rural ones or urban ones? They face different challenges. Husbands, wives, single people, children, teenagers, all of those people are Christians, but they have different needs. You're meeting them in different stages of life. And so hopefully your content would be directed in such a way as to target people in a very specific sort of place. So one of the things that I do in the book, I've given an example of this in the next slide. One of the things I do in the book, Writing for Life and Ministry, is there's a chapter on defining your ideal reader. This is your primary audience. And I'm borrowing that term. I think, ideal reader comes from Stephen King. In his novels, he uses the ideal reader as the person, if you want to know, if you tell a joke, you write a joke in a book, if it's funny to the ideal reader, it doesn't matter if it's funny to anyone else. Like, they're the person that you want to laugh, right? If you're wondering, does this chapter contain too much explanatory detail about some nuanced issue? Well, there's no real objective way to answer that question other than to say, for the ideal reader, does this contain enough or too much detail? And so that person kind of helps you, person or people helps you to figure out not just what to write about, but how to write about it. Is that person a brand new Christian? Is that person a donor? Is that person a pastor? Is that person a pastor of 50 years or a pastor of 6 months? And that makes a difference, right? And so having the specificity really helps. Here's some of I would call these sort of you have demographic questions, like how old are they? Where do they live? Ethnicity, gender, those kinds of things. And you have sort of psychographic questions, like what are they afraid of? Or what are their great aspirations? What do they hope to accomplish in life? When they go to bed at night and can't sleep, what is it that's keeping them awake, right? And I think if you can begin to kind of identify your audience in those terms, not just what do they need to know, but what keeps them from knowing it? What worries them? And those kinds of questions. What I have found I've been at Redeemer City for 3 years, the blog posts, articles, podcasts, etc., that we produce that get the most reaction in our church planting networks and also outside of our church planting networks is when we have church planters tell stories about how they failed in ministry, or they felt unqualified for doing the work that they were doing, and they made mistakes and they learned from them. And the sort of deeply personal self-reflection on the challenges of ministry are our most successful content pieces. And I think that's telling us something about the psychographic of our audience, right? They're concerned that they're not going to do these things the right way. They're planting a church. They've got 60 people meeting in a city of 10 million, and they're wondering if they're even doing anything worthwhile. You know, that's kind of entering the psychological space of that person. So I think this is, again, helps us understand ministry, understand success when it comes to developing content. Who am I writing for, and how can I help that person with the resources I'm creating? And if I help only that person, then I have been successful in my effort to produce resources, right? So I don't mean to belabor the point, but I think that this kind of thing is a really helpful exercise. I know people who are successful nonfiction writers and also fiction writers who do this, like create a persona. They give the person a name, so my ideal audience is, Randall, and Randall is 40 years old and he grew up in a fundamentalist church. And he still loves Jesus, but he's confused about some of these things that he's experiencing now as an adult. And he's got two, children in grade school, and et cetera, right? So it's very specific. And the good news is, Randall's going to be a year older next year and his needs are going to change. And so you revisit this exercise over and over as the kind of person you're writing for matures. I think this is great. A great practice for preaching. I know pastors who do this sort of thing. They'll write even the names of people in their congregation or community at the top of their notes when they're preparing during the week. Name of a non-Christian, name of a young person, name of a parent in the congregation or something. I think this could be hugely helpful for marketing or for fundraising. Instead of just saying like, what's our ideal fundraiser? Someone with money to spare. Well, no, probably your ideal fundraiser is somebody who gets excited when they hear you talk about the vision of the organization that you're raising money for. And what is it that excites that person about it? What need does it meet for them? What passion does it excite for them, et cetera, right? So I think this is a kind of, it can apply in various kinds of content development. Okay, I'm buzzing through it in the interest of time. There'll be plenty of time for questions, I hope, here at the end. So if we determine ministry success in terms of who are we writing for, or content production success in terms of who's our audience, what do they need, that's going to lead us to the question eventually of what do we need to write about for that audience. There's another exercise in the book, and I'll share a link with you to a PDF of an abbreviated version of this. But one of the ways I think really what we're asking is kind of what's your contribution as a writer or as an organization producing resources. And the three areas that I think of in these, when I think about this, are what are you passionate about? What are you knowledgeable about? So passion, expertise, what are you knowledgeable about? And then audience resonance is essentially when you talk about certain things, people light up, or they ask you questions, or they say, ooh, tell us more about that. When you talk about other things, they're like, we like you, but we really prefer when you talk about that other stuff, right? So like they kind of tune out a little bit. I recommend as an exercise sort of sitting down and mapping potential writing projects, content resource projects, etc., against a tool like this. And then what I do is I just put as much as I can in each of those. They're not quadrants. Quadrants would mean there's 4, right? But I can't figure out what you call it if there's 3. So in this thing, in these areas, you put 1 in each. And then if something appears in all 3 of those segments, I drag it into the middle. And that middle, the things that show up in the middle become really good potential subject matter areas for your contribution as a creator, right? So to use my own example for my own writing, I am passionate about history. I have a PhD in American religious history. So that sort of checks top and, left and right. It's something I'm passionate about, something I'm knowledgeable about. I wrote a book on religious liberty based on a figure from the 18th century. I thought it was a timely topic. I thought it was an interesting story. Based on book sales, very few people agree with me on either of those things. And so I have found that even though I'm passionate about church history and I'm knowledgeable about church history, no one seems to care when I talk about it. So that lives in these two, top right, top left categories, but I don't spend a lot of time working on it because it doesn't seem to be a point of resonance with any audience that I have. I'm also passionate about biblical interpretation, and in particular, how my kind of cultural assumptions and formation and those kinds of things influence the way I read the Bible. I am knowledgeable about that in part because of my historical theology background, but also because of a lot of other research and personal experience. And I find that when I talk about those things, people seem to get excited about it. So that's something that kind of I would drag up into the middle, right? That's a topic that I would talk about more. The books that I have written and the talks that I have given on those topics seem to resonate, so that ends up there. You could do this on and on. I love the idea of hobby farming. I don't know anything about it. Nobody cares. Like, that's probably not my area for, contribution as a content creator. I'll just refer people to Windleberry, and then, and we're good to go. So you see the spirit of the exercise at the very least. I'll send, when I'm done sharing the screen, I've got like a 1-page PDF that I'll share that has this stuff on it. What this does is I think it accounts for both you individually, uniquely, or you as an organization, but it's also keeping the audience question in there all the time. What do people respond to? That you're still talking about how you serve the people who are your primary audience, right? Okay, and then the last thing I'll say here, we can talk about all of this at greater length, but I'm just hitting this pretty high level right now. How do you create resources for those people, right? So you know who they are, you know what they resonate with when you talk about certain things that you have a passion about and some expertise in, and now you want to turn that into a plan or into actionable resources. There's a few, obviously, ways to do that. One is just developing habits of writing. If you're in that top category, I love to write and I want to get better at it, right? Then I think a really important first start is developing habits of writing. I try to write 30 minutes a day. COVID-19 really hammered my normal writing schedule. There were like 8 hours when I had to work from home, but my children were still going to school. But I was like, wow, this is going to be a really productive season of my life. And then by the next Monday, we were all home, and we've all been home since March 12th. And I can tell you this has not been the most productive period of my life. So I've got to go back and sort of relearn what the good rhythms are. It almost doesn't matter what you do, I think, as long as you do it regularly, if your goal is to improve. So we sometimes treat writing as if it is a mysterious thing, unlike any other habit, but it's exactly like any other habit. If you want to get better at, running or doing push-ups, you just do them every day. And the same is true with writing. Get up and do it every day. So I keep a journal, a notebook. I write out longhand because that is better for my processing. I type things up about once a month into the computer. Sometimes those things turn into projects, but what I have noticed is that more often than not, if I'm writing every day and then I have to sit down and do something for an assignment for work or something else, I've kept those muscles warm and limber, and it's really easy for me to just sit down and do it. When I'm not writing regularly on my own, it's hard for me to not only work on personal projects, but even work-related projects. I get a little bit out of shape in that regard. So developing habits, and a really important habit, I think, are deadlines. So if you're not in the habit of writing at all, then you should just worry about writing a little every day. If you are in the habit of writing regularly, and you're one of those people who has like 16 novels on your hard drive, and nobody's ever read them, and you go back to revise them, and then they get longer, and they just kind of, a project never ends. For you, probably what you need is to impose some deadlines and ship the things. That doesn't mean publish, but it may mean find somebody who will read what you've written and send it to them and say, I need to hear something back from you in a month or whatever it is, and just start kind of imposing a little bit of structure. And so for some people, the habit is getting in the habit of writing. For some people, the habit is completing projects, and deadlines are really good thing for that. A second document I'm going to share with you in just a minute is it's an excerpt from the book. It's called Your Best 30 Minutes. Especially if you're writing for an organization or as an extension of your ministry and you're not sure where to start, one thing I highly recommend doing is starting with some presentation that you give over and over and over and over again. If it is for fundraising, it's the thing that you say the first time you visit somebody on a potential, cultivating a donor relationship. If you are invited to speak, do, workshops or those kinds of things regularly on a particular topic, if you've been in ministry leadership for any length of time, you've got some stump speech that you have used everywhere and you've got it down cold. And I recommend starting there and putting that into print as a place to begin content development. We found that at City to City, we've done that with a couple of topics where people spend a lot of time flying around the globe doing training and coaching, and a big hindrance for them was the first meeting, that they get a lot of requests for somebody who's interested, saying pastoral coaching, and they spend a lot of time in a first meeting and then it doesn't necessarily go anywhere, and so it feels inefficient. And so what we did was just turn those first meetings into a resource, 30 pages long or something. And now when somebody requests a first meeting, you can say, great, read this first. And then when you have your first meeting, you're really covering like second or third meeting material. It kind of weeds out folks that aren't really serious. They just were bored late at night and sent an email on the about page or something, or, it just kind of helps you manage a little bit the process. And I think it's a great place to start. We do a lot of transcribing and revising as a third. So if you say, well, I've got that best 30 minutes recorded because I've given it a bunch of places, there are great services where you can have it transcribed into a printed document and then edit it from there. And then part of the editorial process, right, would be revising in light of your ideal audience. Who are you writing for? Do they need more information than you normally give? Do they need less? How do you make sure it's specific to your target? And so on. We can talk more about that if you're interested. And I'm on a kick. Maybe this will be bad professional advice, 5 years from now. But right now, I'm on a newsletter kick. Email is making a comeback because, as we mentioned before, there's 500,000 or however many, 500 million, I guess, 500 million blogs out there. The day of just like waking up in the morning and scanning your favorite blogs is sort of over because everything's everywhere. There's new publications. They're trying to curate content for us now because we've killed magazines, and magazines used to curate content for us. And so it's hard to find information because there's so much information. Social media used to be the thing that publishers looked at and said, if you've got a big social media following, then you're probably a good gamble for a book contract. But because people artificially got their social media followings up in order to get book contracts, the publishers are wise to that. Now what I'm hearing in the industry is the most predictable, the most faithful predictor of a success of a book is the size and engagement of an email newsletter audience. Because those people have opted in to get information from you. They are at the very least committed enough to give you their email address. They like your vision, and if they're opening your emails regularly, then you basically have a good gauge at the size of your engaged and active audience. And so I actually find that a newsletter enables you to kind of test out a lot of these other things, right? So I send a newsletter every other week, more or less, and I aim for every other week. That imposes a deadline on me. So every other Friday night, I have to draft an email that goes out on Saturday morning. Some of the things I've written about is I've taken some topics that I've presented at conferences or whatever, turned it into a series for the newsletter and send it out over several installments. It helps me now that I'm regularly writing, and so it develops the habit that way. But it also, what I like about it is, unlike the internet, which is full of trolls, your newsletter audience has opted in. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll unsubscribe. And if they do like what you're saying, they'll send you a nice email every now and then. And so you sort of avoid the nastiness of just posting things on Facebook or Twitter and then getting torn to bits by, strangers. And so I think it's a really great, personally, I like it. And I see some evidence in the market that it's a good thing to do. And so I think that's, if you're curious where to start, if you're wondering with your organization, do I need to launch a blog? Do I need to do a book? Do I need to do whatever? It's very possible that a newsletter is actually a very low maintenance and low risk place to kind of jump into the process and kind of test out all these other things. It helps me because I now have subscribers. Obviously I have quite a few subscribers that I don't know, but like when I first launched it, it was like 100 people and I knew all of them. And so in terms of understanding my audience, it's easy because I can actually like look through the sign up sheet and say, yep, I know this guy and I know her and I know where they live and I know what they're worried about and, et cetera. And so it actually helped me a lot even to develop the habit of thinking very narrowly about my audience. And that's been influential in other writing projects since that launched. So I'm going to stop here to kind of recap. We talked about measuring success. How do we know if we're doing a good job with content resources? And I think a key way to do that is by carefully identifying your audience, which also helps you then figure out what I should write about, and may have some implications for how you go about creating resources. And then we can obviously talk about all of those things as well. But I'm going to pause here. Thank you for that. You can find me, website brandonjobrien.com. Somehow I snagged on all social media things at Brandon J. O'Brien. So whatever your preferred social media thing is, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I'm at Brandon J. O'Brien at all of those things. And so I'd love to connect, and we'll look forward now to some questions from you guys.
Yeah, Brandon, I actually have hopefully. All right. Brandon, I have a whole bunch of different questions that people are sending in. A couple of them that I just want to throw very fast is as director of content is in some sense a fairly new role that a lot of organizations. Do you feel like, especially as an organization is growing younger, they need to find someone to do a content, even if it's part-time? Would you recommend that people prioritize content that way?
Yeah, I do. I think that, so terminology gets a little confusing here, but very often if you were to look up content director, for example, just in general, very often that's associated with marketing. And my job is more resources, so more, but we don't call it publishing exactly. So most places will say you need a content and communications. So somebody who's thinking about your email, somebody who's thinking about your social media, somebody who's thinking about your blog. And then I would add in for, if there's a sort of thought leadership dimension to your organization, somebody who's thinking, who can turn your kind of internal tools, training resources, et cetera, into something distributable, which is essentially what my role is at City to City. And so, yeah, I think that what we're finding at City to City is if you're working with individuals and it requires some level of personal contact and training, it's impossible to scale without distributable resources, because you will always be your own bottleneck, right? If everybody has to talk to you to get the 5 points that are most important about your presentation, or everybody's got to talk to the director of advancement to understand the vision of the organization to be able to donate, then you're limited by the space-time continuum, right? That you can only talk to so many people, you can only work so many hours. But good content resources can stand in for certain aspects of those relationships. And I think organizations struggle that try to add that later, because then they have these deep archives that they have to go back and kind of figure out what to do with. If you can add somebody earlier in the process, I think there's a lot of advantage to that.
One other question is a follow-up, couple questions in terms of newsletters, everything like that, is you have one for yourself, and like, for instance, Tim Keller has a certain personality, but you guys also operate under City to City. At what point do we have our own versus an organization, or do we combine the two together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I keep my own, because unlike Tim, I do not speak for Redeemer City to City in any sort of theological way at this point. So there's a little more blurring in our Redeemer City to City world between Tim's voice and the Redeemer City to City voice. And so my goal with City to City is that when you receive a newsletter from us, when you receive a communication from us, you don't receive a communication from our organization generically. Instead, you receive a communication from a human being. And that means that the voice may be a little different each time, but you're going to hear from Peace and Communications, or you're going to hear from Brandon and Content, or you're going to hear from Erica in Advancement. And that helps. I think we want harmony in that voice, but we don't want it to be homogenous, right? Just sort of a blank thing. So I think that it's best if people get an actual human communication from you, from your organization. And for our money, for what we're trying to do, the more diversity there is in those communications, the better, because we're trying to help people connect with a kind of a global movement. But I think, so I think that it's possible when you're starting out, you are the organization, and then as you grow, it needs to be an organizational voice that can kind of grow with you and beyond you.
With your newsletter, talk us through your newsletter process. What tool do you use? Is this simply MailChimp that you use to send out everything?
Yeah, right now I use MailChimp, and at City City, we just switched to ActiveCampaign. I think is the one. I stay out of the actual logistical sending of the newsletters because that's not my gift. So I'm on I write the contents, but our communications people do the shipping. I like MailChimp well enough. If I were more concerned, if I were selling things directly, I would be very interested in MailChimp. It has a lot of great capabilities for, managing a store and other things. I do find it a little bit cumbersome as just an individual who's sending a pretty simple newsletter. There are a couple others, like Tiny Letter is one that I like. And I had looked into Substack, which is actually a pretty, if you're going to be producing content regularly, people can it's a subscription tool. So people can subscribe for, I think, as little as $5 or $6 a month, $7 a month. And that can be a form of sort of micro donation. So if you want to keep up with the news of the place, you can sign up for the newsletter. If you'd like, say you send a quarterly newsletter, if you'd rather receive something once a month and get sort of like exclusive content, you can subscribe to the newsletter for $7, $8 a month. And along with that subscription comes this additional information, but then it also produces a small revenue stream. So I've thought about moving that route, but haven't, because my role, it's one of those, like a doctor. It's like when you see doctors and nurses who smoke and you think, don't you know better? It's like they don't take their own advice. I feel like sort of with content development, because I do that all the time at work, like I'm not I'm not the person to look at as a success for how to market your own personal writing, because by the evening I'm tired. We do a good job, I think, at City to City, because that's where I expend the vast majority of my creative energy these days.
Brandon, you mentioned a little bit about repurposing content. What process do you use, and what do you repurpose in terms of your content?
Yeah, so at City to City, we have done things with Tim Keller sermons and presentations, for example. We have turned sermons into, I don't have one nearby, but essentially staple bound, if you think of guideposts or Our Daily Bread size thing. So we've done for our donors, for example, once a quarter, a printed sermon booklet from Tim Keller. And so they're audio files that we then transcribe and have to edit pretty aggressively to get the oralisms and the ums and ers and things out, and turn it into a nicely designed resource. How to Reach the West Again was based on, I think in New York, I think in Chicago it was 3 talks. I think in Krakow it was 4, and they were slightly different. And so we combined them, and then, you're thinking about the page. And so some sections were longer in a public delivery, which is fine. But if you're doing it in print, you want those things to be relatively parallel. And so we made, those adjustments. I personally have done a few sermons where, especially if it was a sermon that I preached at our home church, and then somebody invited me to speak somewhere and I preached it again and kind of got better at it. I preach from a manuscript, and so it helps me then to be able to turn that into a resource pretty easily. I think one of the things that I'm learning with our training resources is that anywhere I can get video, even if it's relatively low quality video, if I have something video recorded, I have it as a video asset. I can rip the audio and I have it as an audio asset, and then I can transcribe it and I have it as a print asset. So if I start with video, then I can turn that one thing into 3 things. If I start with audio, I can turn that one thing into 2 things. If I start with print, it's just always print. And so I think that I have tried to capture more things live. for a little while at City City, this was pre-COVID. We haven't been in office, since March, but we had a lapel mic that had a built-in recorder, and anytime anybody gave any training in the building, we hooked them up to the mic and sent them in there to give their training. We downloaded the file, because every now and then somebody walks out of that session and says, I've given that talk 40 times and that's the best I've ever done it. And I want to say, great, now I've got it recorded and I can turn it into a podcast, and I can turn it into an article, and we're ready to go. So that's trying to think ahead a little bit about opportunities to capture things that you could then turn into something else.
Brandon, some people are sitting here will say, man, transcribing, do I have to hire someone to sit there and listen to audio and do it? But there are apps now to do it. Are there a couple of apps that you recommend?
Yeah, I have had a lot of success with a website called rev.com, rev.com. Rev uses human transcribers, so it's a little more expensive. I think the last I looked, it could be different now, it was $1 per minute. So if you have a 60-minute presentation, it's $60 to have it transcribed. The advantage, because it's humans, is you can put in things like you can say, and it's people all around the world. So what's fascinating is you can say, okay, this speaker is speaking English, but is from Brazil, and so has a Brazilian accent. And then they'll find someone who then will hear that accent the right way, and you get a whole lot fewer kind of goof ups in the transcription. They'll also do things like you could say speaker 1 is this name, speaker 2 is this name, and then they'll put all that in there when they transcribe. And so it's a nice, that means, and then they take out all of the ums and ers and the weird pauses for you. So by the time you get the manuscript, there's still work to do. There's still quite a bit of work to do, but it's a whole lot less than if you use an artificial intelligence system. Rev runs an artificial intelligence site called, nope. I thought if I started the sentence, it would come to me, but I can send you the link. But we've had problems with that because it will misunderstand things. And especially if you're doing theological terminology or something, like if you run Ecclesiastes or supralapsarianism or something through artificial intelligence, and they're not going to get it right. So it's helpful to have a person. Rev and a couple other places will also do video subtitling and some translation. So we've used them for a number of those kinds of things as well.
Got it. You mentioned a lot of times you blog at least every other week. Two things someone asks is, how, for an organization, whether it's a company or a nonprofit, how often should they be sending out newsletters? Once a month, every other week? And how long should newsletters or even blogs should be in terms of length?
That's a great question. And I don't know. So I hate to keep going back to COVID, but one of the things I've been reading recently is that, I don't know if you noticed this in your inbox, but like April, May, I started getting much, much, much more email from the places that I subscribe to than I had before. And then now I hardly get any. So there's a sort of, I think people are trying to figure out what's the new appropriate rhythm for communication. I think something like once a month is probably sufficient. We've also toyed at City to City with like bi-monthly, meaning every other month. So I guess that's semi-monthly, 6 times a year. I think it depends on what you're communicating, in the sense that like if we're populating a blog regularly, we're creating a podcast, we have book resources that come out roughly quarterly. If I only send an email every other month, that email is so full of links that someone might have missed from 60 days ago that it feels to me like I should send the email more frequently just to keep people up to date with what we're doing. But if what you're doing is giving updates on a project or something where there are the milestones are further apart, I think you should probably match the frequency of the communication with how frequently you have something to report, right? Otherwise, running a newsletter is like running a blog or whatever else, where it's really exciting at first, and then you're publishing things just because you have to publish something. Like I have to send a newsletter this week because that's what I do. I send it. I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to contribute, but I have a deadline. And I think that people get fatigued when they read that kind of communications regularly. So I think if you've got a a giving campaign and there are 3 milestones per year, then maybe you send 4 emails per year that kind of roughly correspond. If you've got a content project or a building project or something that has more frequent updates, then you could increase the frequency so that it matches the sort of rhythms of your organization. Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to be a burden.
Brandon, I'm not sure a lot of times if you remember this conversation, you and I, either you or Tim back in the days say every single day you guys release a content from city to city. The temptation sometimes is 5 days a week you're releasing a Tim Keller content, but you spread it out between Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. What do you guys release each day? Is it video, audio? How do you guys determine all that?
Yeah, so we've been revisiting that lately. We try to have some sort of a theme over, say, 30 days, over a month. And so we'll look at resources on our website. This is not necessarily a creation theme. This is a communication theme, right? So we may not be creating these resources in this month, but we'll communicate them. So we try to say for the next month, we're talking about the challenges of ministry or something like that. And so those challenges may be mental health, they may be rhythms, they may be work-life balance, they may be disappointment, interpersonal relationships, whatever those things are, or more logistical challenges, preaching, evangelism, programming. And then we do our best. We have a spreadsheet that's sort of like audio, video, visual, print, whatever, and do our best to try to hit all the media types and then try to share them where it's appropriate. So Instagram is great for visual, material. Facebook is good for videos. The blog is great for print. We try to kind of spread it out for different kinds of learners, different kinds of engagers. We also do have a bias toward audio because a lot of our audience is in cities where people have long commutes. And so we like the idea that they'll listen to something while they're on the subway or on something. So that's also a consideration. Again, not the mass market, but just our particular audience. And then in terms of length, I actually read an interesting study lately that longer pieces outperform shorter pieces for engagement online. So I think the average blog post is something like 1,000, 1,200 words, 1,500 words. This research was showing that there is an appreciable difference in engagement when something is longer than 2,000 words. People stay and they read the whole thing and they come back to read the next thing you write. I don't have any idea necessarily why that is. That's the first, I haven't seen that affirmed anywhere else. But I do think that there is so much information. Superficial engagement with lots of topics is easily accessible. What's less accessible is kind of deep engagement on the things that matter. So I think if you're providing that kind of deep engagement, you can do it less often and at greater depth, and people will respond positively to that. At least there's some data to suggest that right now.
Brandon, we have time for 2 more questions. Let me ask you, can you also speak to language? The words we use for a boomer may not connect with millennials. How do we avoid trendy talk? Any word count should we be writing less? And you spoke a little bit about that as well too.
Yeah, so I think again that's the audience. If your primary audience is boomers, write for them, and millennials may not resonate with all of it, but it's not for them. If you are in your 60s and your primary audience is in their 20s, you probably need someone to help you with that process unless you're just particularly good at it, right? And kind of the other way around. So I think I have to be careful about, I'm right on the border. I'm a young Gen Xer or old millennial, but I'm Gen Xer enough to be full of sarcasm. So I have to watch that with both older audiences and younger audiences. The younger ones are just so sincere, I don't even know how to relate to them. And the older ones get offended by the sarcasm. So I have to watch that as well. And sometimes it helps. I would say if you're not sure about the language, one way to kind of help out is to read things that are popular in that age group. That will help you, right? So if you want to know how what your audience responds to, read things that your audience responds to, and that can help. But I think it's really important to be authentic. So don't try to sound like something you're not. I also think in general, George Orwell has these 5 rules for writing that I highly recommend that everybody Google. It's in the book. You can find it there. But the one of them is avoid any language, metaphor, figure of speech, etc., that you are accustomed to seeing in print. And I use that one rule all the time. And it is amazing how fresh your writing will sound if you just refuse to use a mental image, jargon term, etc., that you see everywhere. So we recently, from a city-to-city communication, cut out, somebody said something about a tsunami of mental health issues that's approaching because of COVID. And I was like, nope, that's jargon. Get that out of there. And take the 45 seconds to figure out a better way to say that. And it just freshens up your writing really fast. And so I think I don't use words like social justice warrior. I don't use words like whatever. And partly because there's political connotations with all that, but also because if you just find a different way to say those things, your writing suddenly feels like you're saying something different, even though all you're doing is avoiding really tired terminology. Yeah. So, and I think that actually helps transcend some of the age group challenges a little bit.
Yeah. One last question is, if I'm an organization, nonprofit leader, run my own company, I have to constantly write content, write to my donors. Is it part of just what I'm stuck doing because that's my role? Or would you provide, hey, if you really don't like it, you need to outsource it? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's totally fine to outsource that work to somebody. There's somebody out there who would love to make a living writing and can't. So if you hate it and need to do it, and someone loves to do it and wants to, then that's a pretty great match, right? I think you can still be involved in the writing process in the sense that, you can dictate or something to someone who's going to write something down and send it back to you. That's something that even in my job, even though I do a ton of writing, I'm totally comfortable writing. My team will draft an email in my voice and send it to me and say, does this sound right? And then instead of it taking me 45 minutes to write an email, it'll take me 7 or 8 minutes to just make it mine, right? So in a meeting, I can say, here's the talking points. Can you draft something? And then they'll send it back. And I think if you've got somebody that can do that for you, then that's a huge asset. And especially if it's someone who knows you well, knows your mannerisms or your figures of speech or whatever, and they can actually do a pretty good job giving that first stab in your voice. I don't think there's anything inauthentic about that as long as you do actually look at it and make, give some input. But I think that, if you can find that, that's a good asset.
And ideally, a lot of times finding someone who could stay there long-term with you, because it does take time to know your voice. So you don't want to just constantly play people who are writers, but someone who who gets to know you, who understands your voice.
That's right. Yeah.
And
that helps too with things like transcription and whatever else. If you're transcribing a talk, you have to make it not sound like a talk, but that means you're gonna have to add words, and you're gonna want to not add words that you wouldn't say out loud, right? And so it takes some familiarity with the speaker to be able to do that level of work as well. Yeah.
Brandon, thank you so much. I know it is time for you to go, time for everyone else to get back to work from their lunch. So we're going to have you again, because remember, I love your book about misreading scripture.
Thank you. I'd love to come back. It's been great to be with you all. Thank you.
Got it. Hey, stay with us. Stay tuned. Follow us on social media. The Grow Center Network is similar to Brandon J. O'Brien. We also have the Grow Center Network on Instagram, Facebook, different places. And so follow us on that. We'll have more events next week. We're going to have your teammate, Catherine Leary-Alsdorf, Andy Crouch, David Kinnaman. So we'll have a bunch of different people coming on. So thank you, Brandon. Thank you. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.